What's going on, FUD Nation, and welcome back. 2019 has been a very interesting year, but one thing has proven true, and that is that good projects with strong fundamental news are able to see gains. And that's a distinct difference from 2018, where almost no project was able to see pumps, no matter if they had the best news streaks in the world. Now, if you look at projects like ChainLink getting listed on Coinbase, announcing a partnership with Google, you're seeing dynamic and incredible pumps out of projects like those, while the entire market might not be experiencing the exact same thing. And that's why it's important to now turn our eyes to the altcoin market with a fresh lens, trying to wipe away the biases that we've had towards projects for years past and starting to look at projects that are just emerging and creating positive, fundamental, strong foundations for themselves. And in trying to shine a light on these projects, I think it's appropriate that we bring on the channel someone that I consider one of the strongest researchers who focuses on brand new projects that often are overlooked by other more prominent content creators. So please give a warm FUD TV welcome to Blockchain Brad, who you probably know, you've probably already followed, you've probably seen some content that Brad has already made. We do talk about everything in this episode, but we try to focus on some altcoin projects, some new altcoin projects that you should be aware of. I'm going to put some timestamps in the description below so you know a little bit more about where to look for key pieces of information, or you could just skip to the very end of this video if you just want to hear the names of the projects. But I think this video will benefit all of you, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. Welcome to the show, Brad Laurie, also known as Blockchain Brad, one of the most tireless researchers and educators in the blockchain space. Thank you so much for coming on FUD TV.
Mate, thank you. I mean, you're very much well known in the space, and it's an honor to be able to talk to you. So Elliot, thank you very much, mate.
Well, I just want to start here by laying a little foundation. Can you please tell us how you got into blockchain? What attracted you to this crazy world of decentralized cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology?
Yeah, mate. Firstly, thank you again, and it's a great honor to be able to speak with you. You have a huge platform, and mate, to be totally transparent, as an Aussie, that's what we tend to be. We're quite direct. I came into this space a few years ago, actually. My background is in education. I've been a teacher prior to this, and I was just really lucky. You know, I'd taken some time off work. We'd moved as a family. I have 3 kids, and very fortunate to have an amazing wife who's also a teacher, and she had been relocated into a new position. So it gave me a bit of time to, I guess, you know, reassess what I wanted to do. And I just by chance stumbled across a Bitcoin documentary. You know, and ironically now I know many of those people in that documentary, but it really got the blood pumping. And it really made me start to investigate more about blockchain, which was my genuine passion. I really wanted to understand and explore what the nature of it was, what the mechanics of it were. And because I don't come from a techie background or a technological background per se, typically those sort of things wouldn't excite me. But for some reason, blockchain really did. I really wanted to understand the inner workings. So what I did was I started to just reach out to some of the blockchains that I felt were of merit at the time. I wanted to understand how they were developing, especially with regard to smart contract solutions, because to me, I wanted to see how that would actually build out a more vast and viable ecosystem of applications, which was always something, you know, at the forefront of my mind, is moving beyond just currency, which at the time I didn't realize how important it was, because back then I didn't really understand the fundamentals of money. And I had no reason to, because I didn't really know there was an alternative. But now I also have a genuine love and respect for Bitcoin in its premise, especially, you know, when you read its white paper. And then now having the privilege of watching different startups unfold. So that was my experience.
So what time was this? What year was this?
So that was 2017, probably early in that time period. And again, it was probably just fortuitous because, as you know, there was such a significant wave of interest, and there was a lot of hype and a lot of attention brought forward. But I was starting to enter into that space just before that happened. And it's interesting because at that time, I didn't even know that there was money involved. I didn't really understand that there were exchanges and that people were trading these so-called tokens. For me, it was just really exploring, you know, what these companies were about and what these startups were about and what these, I guess, decentralized entities that were emerging, and obviously we see the likes of now commodities, which is, the bedrock of everything with Bitcoin and Ethereum. So as I started to learn more and more, I started to try and reach out and focus on understanding exactly what this emergent space was about and exactly how it could benefit people. That truly was what drove me. And now, if we fast forward to today, having 3 girls, having 3 children that I really want to see, benefit from the blockchain, absolutely, mate. Like I think that the potentials for this in the future are so immense, and they really will break down borders that afford them, more autonomy and more of a say, and not just in the all important financial domain and paradigm. I think it's going to push beyond that into real, genuine use cases. But yeah, it's been an evolution in the process, Elliot, and it's been a long time, mate, between the time when I came in as a naive educator, or in a different sense, to now trying to also support the education of crypto, blockchain, and just, distributed ledger technology more generally. Sorry, mate, I think I've lost your audio. I can't hear you. Not sure why. I wonder if perhaps it's muted on my side. I'm not sure. But I'll just check. But I definitely can't hear you at all, Elliot. I wonder what happened. Oh, I can hear you now. I just heard you.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Let me try. So I switched to my, it switched to a mic, and now hopefully it'll switch back. Okay, yeah, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, yep.
Perfect.
It's a bit faint.
A little bit faint. Well, let me
yeah.
The sensitivity here. How about now? Is that better?
Yeah, that's much better, mate. Yeah.
Okay, great. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I know that when I came into this space, my passion has always been product focused, and I felt like for what felt like the first time, in traditional startups, you don't have access to early stage investing. That's a guarded wall unless you're actually, in a dorm with someone who's cooking up the next Facebook, or you happen to be a VC with, privileged access. And a lot of capital to deploy. There's no way to really participate in these journeys. And I always felt like I could see products becoming successful far before they were successful. And that was fun to me. Like I always enjoyed finding music artists before they popped and finding different things before they pop. And now it felt like I got to participate, and be a stakeholder. And so that was really, alluring. And then of course, over the time of being in the space, there was just a frustration that set in that people weren't delivering on these promises. And then, 2018 was an interesting year. And now we have 2019, where all of a sudden the promises are starting to be delivered on. And you have companies that are starting to show the same type of excitement that you had about 2 years ago, as far as, oh my gosh, is this actually a token that we should be holding? Is this actually an ecosystem that's going to grow, that's going to partner with Google or do these things that we had only imagined? And that's when I think it's a really wonderful time to be bringing your perspective to the mainstream here, because that, I jokingly say that you review companies before they have white papers. You're reading their white papers before they even have them. You're really on the ground level here, and you're seeing projects at the earliest stage. So I think it's a great time to really get inside your brain and understand some of this hard work that you're doing and share your wisdom with the audience here.
Well, Elliot, thank you so much. And it reminds me a bit of a tweet I put out yesterday when I was talking with Peter McCormick, just in a bit of collegial banter we've been having lately, because obviously he's a very vocal, dare I say, Bitcoin maximalist, and I certainly don't judge, anybody else for their own viewpoints, but I don't share necessarily that same view. But one of the things I did tweet about was this idea of pre-utility. So, harping back to research, one of the things that perhaps people criticize that when they analyze the success or lack thereof of previous so-called altcoins, one of the things I do say is, don't forget the model of raising. Don't forget, what an IEO or ICO actually meant, because a lot of the time people, they they conflate both the ICO and IEO with the actual startup, when in fact that can be problematic, because essentially what many of them were doing, some benign, some legitimate actors, and some obviously not, the majority actually, is that they were trying to find means to start to test the waters of their theory. That white paper was a theoretical, underpinning. They needed capital to start to obviously, have technologists to try and experiment with the code, yourself as a coder. So I use the term pre-utility because these kinds of new digital assets didn't exist before. So some of the proponents of Bitcoin maximalism may easily just say, look, everything else is just a, coin. Or they may say that everything else is just, noise in the background. But the reality is that in many instances, they were pre-utility bets. Mm-hmm. So me, for example, as an investor, if I wanted to invest early, the reason I was so wanting to, understand and work with fellow researchers around the world, was we wanted to be able to benefit from the openness of the ecosystem and try to access some of these investments if in fact we wanted to put that high risk scenario to play, because at that time it was pre-utility. You didn't know, and you still don't know in many instances, if it was going to play out and become and evolve into that prospective utility. So it's interesting you say what you're saying now about subsequent to that era of hype, because now perhaps some of these, if we reduce it down, have actually got to the point where they can start to empirically show their utility because they've utilized that capital in the way intended. The problem was the majority didn't. And so discerning and understanding and navigating these very convoluted waters is tough because very muddied. And it was certainly a problem in a time when everyone was just so busy trying to not only understand the wider space, but just try to get involved and engage in what was a very sort of hype-driven sort of time in crypto's history. Now I think we're starting to see things emerge, that are more tech-centric.
Yeah, and I think it's a great time to be having this conversation. In traditional world, you might have to raise $50,000 from people people that trust you. Try to cobble it together. There's a lot of ways, but then you want to get this barely functional prototype that you can then get someone to give you maybe $100,000, maybe a few $100,000, and then you get it to a point where you're actually bringing on users and showing revenue streams, and now you're trying to actually match your product market fit, is what they call it, in your MVP, and then all of a sudden you're now in a place where you can raise millions of dollars based on proof that your concept is working, and there's subsequent rounds. Whereas we had it kind of like backwards, right, where you had someone with a shiny, not even that shiny, it was just a white paper, sometimes without even images, and it would end up attracting tens of millions of dollars. And so it's a problem of human nature at that point, where the incentive to work hard and to be gritty and to grind it out and to make this a reality gets stripped away because you've already gotten the golden goose payment at the end, and most people just don't have the grit. But before we go down that rabbit hole, I want to take us out of this, and I want to focus on some good things. It's 2019, and we've seen amazing projects come to the collective front of vision. And I want to sort of give you an opportunity to shine a light on some of those great projects instead of focusing on all the things that have gone wrong over the last 2 years. Let's focus on these good projects, because I know you are doing some amazing research. What is one of your favorite projects? And I'll play a game where I ask skeptical questions, and you can tell me why. Maybe it's a good project.
It's interesting, because even today, I want to just put a disclaimer in here. We don't know. We're still in an experimental period where we're still trying to, most importantly, see if token modeling can correlate with these new and emergent startups. That's really important to put that in, because I still feel that there's an immense dearth of that correlation and of that logic. Mm-hmm. And for that reason, you still have largely highly speculative token investments, let's say. But what I will say is that with regard to looking in the future, I'm very much interested in those that have mainnets established. I'm very much interested in those that have, the evidence of widespread distribution for the use case of utility, if that's what they are. If they're a commodity, very different, because obviously there's a marketplace for that. And right now, even from the top down, there's efforts to try and legalize and make those I guess you'd call them entities of some kind legitimate. But yeah, I mean, if we're looking right now specifically today at those that are starting to empirically show, I will say that I'm interested in some of the financial digital assets, because I still think that we need to look at the infrastructure for finance, and I'll talk about a few that are of interest. But then I also think there are certain verticals, and it's interesting we're talking because you have a lot more knowledge of the technological aspects of gaming, but I'm very much interested in the prospects of non-fungible tokens, and coupled with a means to try and develop some sort of legitimate utility token, or I like to also acknowledge them as some sort of economic asset as well, digital asset, because it's more than just that utility. So without being too verbose, that's another vertical that I'm very much interested in. And then obviously harping back to those original digital assets, I'm very interested in seeing how sound money plays out. Because whilst, a lot of people aren't interested as an investment in sound money, in the interim, it's so lucrative for them because it is so highly volatile. And from in that respect, the volatility is still a carrot. It's still a draw card for those parties who are coming in, hoping for something of, a beautiful outcome of sound money in the, final stages of development or of its evolution. But now, the prospects, for example, of something like Bitcoin, which we can talk about, is on my radar, as it evolves in time, and other more aligned sort of currency sort of focused or money focused endeavors. So going back to one example of one that I've certainly invested in, and something that a team that I respect is called Arweave. So Arweave, yes, it's the CEO's name is Sam Williams. He's from the UK. Now, I'm not saying this because I invested. Once again, I invested when it was immensely risky to even do so. And I did that on the basis of far more than their white paper, because I was lucky enough as well, Elliot, to, when I would research something, I would really push quickly to try and get to that team, really try to understand what they were about, what their technological merit was, and what their vision was, and what their credentials were, which a lot of people I don't think looked at enough. So they're very much trying to change and shift the idea of how we can store data. So rather than, rely on these centralized mechanisms, they want to be, and I know we hear this word used a lot, but they want to genuinely distribute and decentralize the means in which we store data. So, for example, we talk about this idea of decentralizing internet values to make them more accessible to the globe. But in the context of the value of data itself, if that's part of the new gold narrative, the new, one of the new key assets of the future. Mm-hmm. One thing we don't talk enough about is how, that data is stored and what access and rights do we have to that? And, how permanent is that? So with Arweave, through their different technologies, what they are trying to do essentially is make it permanently stored in such a way where we can have some sort of interaction, say, voice and autonomy in that storage process. And I think what's also important is to acknowledge the kinds of support that Arweave have. They aren't, one that's just where there's a complete lack of evidence of support, both in the mainstream ecosystem, but also in the broader system of capital support.
So I think with a project that sounds super, super compelling, and certainly can be extremely disruptive. My biggest question when it comes to projects like Arweave is, where does the demand start to really actually make sense? Where a lot of what I see as challenges for these tokenized infrastructure platforms is that we talk a lot about scaling because we had those few months where really days where Bitcoin was overloaded and Ethereum was overloaded, and there's been random like Sybil attacks on Ethereum that have filled up their blocks. But for the most part, we don't have full blocks. We don't have full blocks on EOS. We don't have full blocks. I guess EOS had a random thing recently where they were being spammed, but we don't have full blocks on Tron. We don't have full blocks on really a lot of times on Ethereum. And so it's, to me, is a question of, I want to see those demand layers be thought out as well. And I think that's why token holders are getting the shit end of the stick. Because they are buying something that could be successful iterations in the future and as mass adoption comes. But until then, the supply and the demand curves for the token holders, it's hard for that to create gains, right?
I totally agree. And one of the issues also comes back to utility itself, because one of the things I think, Elliot, a lot of people don't talk about, and we can go there today, is that in many instances, from my understanding and experience in the past, even when you look at VCs, for example, whilst that was one of many other things, criteria that I would look at in terms of what are the value, what's the value add for the investors? You know, when we're talking about high-end investors and VCs, there's certainly a range of quality, let's say, or, you know, there's a range of evidence to sit from those who are just purely crypto-centric and there for that immediate gain, or those that have also got evidence of very sound and longitudinal investments outside of crypto. So, you know, getting back to the question of utility, often that wasn't even respected, you know, in the broader sort of scope of crypto, because many of these VCs were actually capitalizing on the hype and FOMO, and they were leaving. They would either OTC their own investment, or they would capitalize on that gain and leave. So once again, you'd have to ask yourself, in that instance, was it even a utility? You know, from their perspective, probably not, you know, because it didn't. That's why I'm talking about pre-utility, because in that period of time, it doesn't have the functionality, it doesn't have the form of a utility, and cannot be so. So in Arweave's point, the reason why I mentioned the imperative, whether you look at Arweave or whether you look at any others, it's so important that we start to valorize mainnets. We start to valorize, you know, subsequent moves where they can start to operate as utilities and test the waters. And I agree with you, mate, 100%. This time period subsequent to that, when they're starting to just grapple with the gravity of crypto, with the complexities of it, and the major challenge of trying to garner support, whether that be from users or whether that be from the, you know, more complex sort of crypto audience. We're starting to see that empirically, Ethereum, for example, has such a strong developer base, you know, and you're also an expert in some other key platforms, but having developers is essential to build out, you know, that the meat in the merits of that project. But I think one thing we don't talk about enough is the agenda for the user. You know, what's in it for them, and how do you once again start to create what is almost a seamless and invisible value proposition of the blockchain or of the technology, whereby by default the application becomes paramount. And that's why I wanted to mention Arweave, because what they are trying to focus on is not so much, you know, the utility agenda, you know, from the way that we think about it in crypto. We're actually starting to think about it from the user's perspective, trying to make it so that it's irrelevant what the technology is actually doing to the layperson who's trying to actually potentially have access to something they've never had before, which is control of their data in a permanent way, you know, in the sense of storage. So I think we're up against an immense challenge trying to sell a narrative we've never even heard of before. You know, what is the value prop of autonomy? You know, how do you sell what is a relatively complex technology as well in concert with that narrative? I think the only way is actually from the application itself. So as Arweave starts to build that capacity, and it starts to become seamless and easy to use, I think that's when you're going to see a much greater expansion of their actual utility value. And not by price, but by default, you know, in terms of the magnitude of its reach. Because I really think that, even I was talking to Matt Spoke the other day, whom I'm sure you know from Aon, and what they're doing is they haven't pivoted, they've just expanded, you know, their approach and almost made it sort of into two branches, where now they have what they call the Open Application Network. And again, like, I'm not invested in this, but I do believe that Matt's vision is on the money, because what he's now saying is one of the big problems with almost every startup in the last few years that they haven't done is they haven't backmapped from that app, you know, and not DApp. I'm not talking about DApps. I'm talking about just apps, making sure that the mainstream actually has relevance and that the user is sort of paramount to, ironically, everything we've done in the past. So,
yeah, I think it's certainly something I feel passionately about, which is, you know, I heard CZ talk about it, and he was like, we didn't want to create 17 products at first. We didn't want to create an ecosystem. We just wanted to create one thing. And as I mentioned to you before we started the stream, that was the product that people wanted to use, which was a crypto to crypto trading ecosystem where you felt safe enough to use and you were able to get the coins you wanted. And so, and with liquidity. And so they were able to provide that product. And you see all these infrastructure plays and people that are building, the equivalent of electrical grids and sewage systems and all these wonderful things. But where are you bringing the people? Where are you building these? And how are you going to attract people to put a strain on that grid, to put a strain on those infrastructures that you're building? And I think that that's really the new phase. And that's certainly something, that's why I feel passionately about gaming. We're not we're not building a layer one protocol. We're building a game, because we know that if it's an amazing game, that people will use it, whether it's blockchain or centralized or whatever, and they'll give value. And they'll give value to the items that they're interacting with. Because
I'm so with you on this, because we spent way too long, and especially me as someone who was a part of a group of researchers, just reaching out to different people I'd found on Twitter or in different, that I really noticed stood out. I, eventually formed a small group, and we would just research all day, like absolute blockchain nerds. And we loved it. But one of the things we sometimes would miss was understanding, that at that time, there was just no way to assess empirically whether any of this was going to play out. And now I'm much more focused on the user. So that's why I agree with you. That's why I've looked heavily into gaming, for example, because not only is there an absolute use case proof there, but if you look more into tokenized models, they existed pre-blockchain, having that means in which cryptography can couple with blockchain to afford some sort of new innovation. And it's nothing unknown to gamers worldwide, that whereby tokens can actually be of value. Mm-hmm. What really got my attention with gaming, for example, and unfortunately just having 3 girls, is that, we were, as parents, spending quite a lot of money on these assets that our kids would engage with. Mm-hmm. But the problem was there was just never a discussion, never a thought of autonomy, of control, of transferability, and even cross-game, cross-chain. There's so much potential afforded by the innovations of technology that underpin it and don't need to be known necessarily by the gamer, but the asset needs to be known.
I think you're absolutely right, but I'd take it even further and say that most gamers don't really, those aren't selling points, right? The game still has to be amazing. The game has to be competitive with any other game. And that's, I think, where that's the standard that I want to see others approaching their projects with. And that's how we've dictated everything, which is, of course, we're going to create this amazing blockchain-centric platform. But if you stripped the blockchain away and no one ever knew, would they play it over this game? Would they play it over
I totally agree. And once again, I'm so glad we're talking about this, because as someone who's sort of underneath the app level for so long, my world has been all about, it's kind of like, if you use the analogy of the different layers of the earth, I've been at that crust level, or underneath the ground, in the dirt. And quite often, we're not looking at all of the different skyscrapers that are being built, the magic that's, now emerging. And that's sort of what you're alluding to. Mm-hmm. And what I like to see is when the blockchain becomes irrelevant, to them. It's just, again, a mechanism for them they don't need to know, much like TCP/IP for the internet. We hear that narrative a lot, but it is true. How many of us in the world actually understand the fundamentals of how the internet works? It's irrelevant for many because they're looking for use case and looking for, seamlessness and economy of time.
On that note, who do you think is doing a good job of speaking to these end users?
In terms of gaming?
In terms of any project in the space?
Well, again, it all comes down to empirical evidence rather than what we think, because we've passed that stage of, just speculating, I think. So it all comes down to the depth of development. So let's talk about Ethereum, for a start. Sure. The evidence is there that there is a strong uptake from developers. I still think, though, we go back to that bedrock infrastructure. That's where there is some value in that reciprocal understanding between what the applications are, what their value prop is, and what is the quality of the tech that supports it. So right now, I think that it's a default scenario. It's the best we've got in terms of the holistic sort of elements that align to make this plausible and possible. I don't think it's going to be necessarily the case, in decades to come, we're going to see, very fair game when it comes to the very strong propensity for different startups to make the switch. And I'm talking about applications and talking about developers as well, because that's getting easier and easier as well for developers to make those choices, as we also expand on the programming languages that are supported on some of these new and innovative platforms. And history also suggests the case that, we might start off with a Daimler or a Ford, but we're not always going to be stuck with that. And even smart contracts, they weren't the agenda for the initial beginnings, So the potentials to really build an ecosystem have always been there. Since, it was brought to light perhaps with Vitalik. We know the smart contracts existed even sort of before then in terms of potential. But what really matters, I think, is that you literally can start to showcase an infrastructure that can scale in concert with the depth of development. And that's not the case at the moment with Ethereum, I don't think. Like you alluded to, it's not full blocks.
Certain parts, right? Like certain parts are we can't run certain applications off Ethereum in its current state, but soon, hopefully we will, it'll be more scalable or whatever than the other ones like EOS and Tron and these other ones that are really going after DApp usage. But at the same time, do you care if you have to wait 5 minutes? I was having a conversation with a really, really brilliant individual who said, do you care if you have to wait 5 minutes to get a new mortgage or to get something like that, which does that need to be instant? And I would say no, that in that particular instance, security is way more important than the instant gratification. But do you want to actually play a video game where you have to wait 5 minutes to swing a sword? No, that's not a situation that you can work with.
Exactly.
But these more serious uses and like the DeFi stuff where it's like, okay, do I really care if this loan takes 10 minutes to go through? Or for these more serious financial decisions, if they're slowed down by a more secure network? I think people want the security, and there is where Ethereum is really thriving to me, is on the more serious applications that are decentralizing financial products. I think there's a real lane there that Ethereum's found.
I think it's transient, though, to be honest with you, because if we look outside of the scope, often the real means for scholarship or the real means for testing the waters is actually in what's existed before, what predates the crypto equation. So yes, it's true. In this interim period, whilst everything is quite experimental, perhaps that, the time issue is not relevant, but it will come to be, especially as more parties start to challenge in terms of making it more, their financial products and services more accessible, especially if they start to make things much more expedient. That's when people, like in any scenario, the products and services will actually dictate their decisions. And I think that even you and I as consumers, we will do the same. But for now, there's less focus on the speed of blockchain and more so on the prospects of what applications it can actually offer. So right now, we're seeing DeFi as a narrative. We're playing around with the idea. Ethereum is doing an immensely important job in trying to showcase some of these key digital assets of the future and also these important infrastructural frameworks. So like if we look at the things like DAI, if we look at Compound, if we look at the likes of, the list goes on. There's a significant number, but I think once again, it harps back to our age-old narratives we've seen. We have to make sure that inside the scope of DeFi, that there's logic in that startup and that it actually has evidence of staking that makes sense, because staking is still, a big question for a lot of people, all the way to the very top when it comes to the SEC. But it has to be relevant and it has to be secure, like you said, especially when it comes to money. But then on the flip side, like you're alluding to, when it comes to the everyday applications that we all just want to get on with and start to use, they do need very strong scalability. And right now, there's a lot of questions about layer 2. Whether or not that's the best way forward, or whether or not you build into the layer 0, layer 1s.
Well, a lot of layer 2 is quite centralized. And so it becomes a question of what's the point of fixing this with a completely centralized fix when, in the end, I'm not talking about Lightning Network, everyone, in case that's triggering. I'm talking about more layer twos that you're seeing proposed for like Ethereum and stuff like that. You're seeing a lot of essentially centralized computing offloading from the network and then batching transactions back. But there is essentially, you've created sort of an old system to patch the new system. Now, I'm not saying that that's entirely wrong, right? You can build in more safeguards. But yeah, there's still we're in a very transitional phase. You cannot run the highest quality of applications like Uber completely decentralized yet. It's just not the case. But there's the promise, right? And I believe in that, and that Web3 promise. The game that we're going to be using, the assets will all be kept in their wallets and stuff like that. But at the beginning, you'll download a game client to play, and so there will be elements of it that are run in a traditional sort of computing process way. You won't. It's not hitting the blockchain when you try to hit the character in front of you, but all of the actual assets don't move until the blockchain moves.
Yeah, and I tend to agree. And I think that sometimes we overuse the term decentralization, because even though obviously we're both proponents of that, and essentially that means that we create a complete new shift in not just monetary paradigms, but even when it comes to asset, paradigms. We're trying to change the game so we have more autonomy in the sort of asset equation. Mm-hmm. But once again, when we talk about things like gaming, for example, when we talk about the necessitates with regard to scalability, I think that we're going to see a significant change in the future with regard to harping back to layer ones. And what I mean by that is, right now, I think there's a bit of a sort of wait and hold position for some of the very strong tech teams we haven't even yet seen start to test the waters yet. They're going to come. When they do, there's a very strong suggestion that they're going to offer platforms where those apps can, switch in to a different gear, because what we're talking about with Ethereum is potentially that band-aid solution at the moment. And obviously, I'm a huge supporter of Vitalik and his work. I'm never going to suggest that they aren't, a key player in the space now. But I'm also very cognizant of the speed of technology itself, the way things move ahead, and we all have to make sure we're on the ball with that. We're right at the pulse of crypto, and right now we're starting to see that many of these infrastructural solutions of the future are very much wanting to capture the market share of things like gaming. And the question will be, can they actually, enable and facilitate a faster uptake for the gamer who really doesn't care what platform they use, but they care that it's just so seamless and so easy. And most important, like you said, and it's, I think, the most important, and that is that the game itself is on par with the best of the best, and can be so on the blockchain. When we start to see that, oh man, I can't wait, because that's where my kids are going to engage. They don't care about all the rest. They care that that game is awesome, it's fun, and what I care about is that they have those digital assets that they own, so that I'm not out of pocket when they start to have that in their own, they have their own wallets, they have their own means of trade. They can engage in a marketplace that they couldn't before.
Yeah, and it'll become one of those things that's like, oh, hey, no one really cared or knew about it, but now that they're in the ecosystem because they play the game every day, now they're seeing this added benefit that they didn't have before. And wow, that's actually really cool. And hey, why don't other games do it? They should do it. And then all of a sudden the push comes from consumer desires, not from, the way that most people are engaging with blockchain right now, which is essentially hope for the future, hope for speculative sort of things that aren't existing.
Exactly.
On that note, what other projects are you excited about that you think are doing a good job of focusing on that end goal?
Good question. So obviously oracles are really interesting to me. The question is whether or not, and I'm sure I hope you share the same sentiment, we don't know if there are, the token themselves of many of the oracle-based startups is actually necessary. We just don't, and the reason we say that is because even today, we have some of the key experts in the space saying that much of the price of crypto startups is, driven by speculation. So understanding firstly what the value is of a token is difficult to do, but then understanding whether it needs it just doesn't get asked enough, because obviously in this ecosystem, many are trying to support the volatility, because in that you have financial success. You have opportunity, and that's great. I don't just sort of try to devalue, this key point in time when everything is, emerging, and it is so sort of plastic or malleable.
Obviously, oracles. I know one particular coin always jumps to mind. Go ahead. Go ahead. You do honors.
Well, with ChainLink, obviously with Sergey leading the way, I think that it's really important. When you look at the broader scope of things, exactly what he's trying to do, it certainly has use case. There's no question. When you look at the scope of not just those, more immediate partners that often use for many cryptos to sort of sell its narrative, but these are genuine, authentic, and long-term partnerships that are important, not just for crypto, but for mainstream. So the Oracle system is built, it's very, relevant, but then there's also lesser known ones. So what I'm doing now is I'm trying to play the devil's advocate, and I'm starting to sort of think, okay, yes, we know the use case is there. We're still questioning, perhaps in many respects, the need for tokens in this instance. But I need to look at the sentiment of the people, the sentiment of and observe the crypto economy itself. Mm-hmm. And right now, there's some attention, coming forth for lesser known, less liquid assets. And the reason I mention this is because once upon a time, ChainLink was the same. Once upon a time, there were not that many people talking about ChainLink and the need for it. And so when I see that happen, I start to look at other startups that are doing something or proposing something similar, but you haven't yet had, the kind of depth of support. So
I'll ask
one example. Yeah,
I'll ask them before you go into these other Oracle solutions, which I do want to circle back to. Do you think that ChainLink is setting itself up to be in an Ethereum-like position where it now has it's up to ChainLink to fail to deliver before others can really become that go-to platform that is taking the majority of the behavior of the users, right? So you have Google's and you have all these other very legitimate companies saying, hey, we're going to use ChainLink. And so until ChainLink really doesn't offer the solution that they need, it feels like ChainLink will become kind of the mecca of accessing data from smart contracts through oracles. And then
it's a great question.
Yeah, it's like, does the way Ethereum, right? You have Ethereum killers that are faster, easier to use, cheaper, better, all these stronger. Yet all the developers still choose Ethereum. All of the main companies and countries that are building stuff on the blockchain are all choosing Ethereum because it is occupying firmly that position of the flexible smart contracts ecosystem.
I love the question, and I do agree with you. I think that it has the network effect, to put it frankly, especially when it comes to Western markets, especially in the US and that whole belt, right through. Even in my region of Australia, there's a lot of credibility that's been afforded to that team, and reciprocally so. All the evidence is there. So just moving away, I mean, I don't hold any ChainLink, I probably should have, but the point I'm making here more is that network effects, even Pompliano has said, and he's a serious advocate for Bitcoin, they cannot be understated. They're so important to the success of a utility, especially in that pre-utility era and phase. So when it comes to answering the point, as clearly as I can, they are the dominant sort of oracle of service, and the potential for them just to really expand in even the private sector is immense. And I know that's where Sergey is really focused. And once again, it makes me want to research even more, and I'd love to have a discussion with him, because if we start to see those borders break down between permission, private systems and networks, and the public chain come to the fore, that's where something like ChainLink will really start to show its true.
It's inevitable, right? It's inevitable. Yeah. You can't have siloed information in the era. It's inevitable. So the interoperability buzzword meme it has become, that. To me, I laugh because I'm like, of course, everything's going to be interoperable. Nobody's saying they don't want interoperability. Nobody's saying they want siloed sort of database.
Exactly. Right.
So it's all this sort of excitement of, oh my God, it's interoperable. To me, is almost like a nothing burger, because it's like they're all going to be.
I know, that term gets so oversold. It's so ridiculous. Yeah. But going back to ChainLink, I was going to sort of just push, one idea. That is perhaps, looking at regionality, looking at geography. Because what I'm starting to see now is the possibility of some other Oracle solutions that are adopted in different regions, especially when we see a bit of a pushback from different political agenda. So I will mention one. I still am looking very much more into it, and Sorovus knows this, the CEO. I saw them on stage recently speaking. So Band Protocol, I've interviewed them and done a free interview. There was no agenda. I'm not invested in them or anything like that. But I wanted to reach out to them for a few reasons. I'd seen some of the backers behind them. I knew that they had a very strong position in Asia, but they also had potentially a strong credential, history. So for now, it's, certainly looking into that more, backed, and supported. Well, I shouldn't say backed, but it's certainly supported by Binance in the fact that they are now, there's a listing, association. So that means a lot. When it comes to network effects, you don't sort of, ignore the moves from CZ, you don't ignore Binance. And I want to know more about Band Protocol. So that's one of my agenda, and I'm going to be talking to Sorovus again.
And what's the ticker for that?
I think it's Band, B-A-N-D.
Band Protocol. There you go.
Yeah.
I've not researched this very much at all, but I think on the note you're saying about regionality, there's very much so still a fragmented world here. I had a conversation with Kin from Tomo Chain, and they're explaining all the excitement and the success that they're having in Vietnam with local enterprise, local business, and serving a Southeast Asian market that's being largely overlooked by other, people that are shooting for more first-tier markets. And so I think that's very interesting, right? That you could start attracting a patriotic sort of local fan base, the way you would around other types of products. You don't usually think of internet products as highly regionalized like that. You think of them in the network effect, which is why everyone got so excited in 2017, because it was like, hey, I remember when I first heard of Facebook, and then 2 months later, everyone's talking about it, and then all of a sudden it's the biggest company of all time. Maybe this is just like that, and it spread like wildfire. And now we're seeing that when it comes to things like trust mechanisms and money mechanisms, the ability for people to jump ship is much slower. I feel like than oh cool, you can now watch movies on your computer, great. Whereas it doesn't take much convincing, right? Where it's like, hey, instead of storing your money in a bank, you could do it like this. And it's like, I don't know how much I feel about, I don't know how I feel about that, like
information. I remember asking this question to someone recently as well, Elliot, and they were saying that they felt they needed another catalyst. Perhaps they're right. I mean, maybe people need more of a push, a utility push, or a bit of a push in some respects. It's possible. But if you go back to the network effects of, talking about Asia compared to some other regions, because Asia is a hot region right now, Europe also, for many reasons. One is just the open, borderless sort of acceptance of blockchain. We know that's beyond even China. Certainly hubs like Hong Kong, especially Singapore, absolutely, it's quite progressive, and so is Europe. But one thing we don't talk about is pre-network effects. So it's one thing to, have network effects from actual, proof of value. But one of the things that I've really noticed in crypto is that before, in that period of time, since the team had the white paper, they proposed that to the VCs, and I was lucky enough to sometimes even, see some of this play out, is that pre-value prop, requires a network as well. Right. And I call that the pre-network effect, because that's how something like ChainLink did really well. They didn't just have an immense network effect because of their, genuine utility prospect, but they had a very well-structured pre-network effect as well, a very well-architected, endeavor when it came to understanding the way that crypto works. And they also had confidence in their product. Now, in that context also, once again, we have to be really cognizant that price, even Sergey would argue, is not necessarily a reflection on ChainLink or on Band or any of these. It's not. That's determined by the market. The price,
when ChainLink had its surge this summer in June, I believe, when Bitcoin was booming as well, was that because all of a sudden the demand for the ChainLink tokens for people who are operating within their Oracle networks surged? No, it was because they got listed on Coinbase and because they got the Google partnership. So it's all it is real utility, but it's still the token value is completely
exactly.
What are your favorite coins in the space? Rattle them off, no particular order. just for people to know that these are projects you've looked at. You don't have to go into deep explanations, but just to wrap this up, as someone who is deep in the white papers, what are the projects that in 2019, as we enter the roaring 20s here, what should we be looking at? What are the topics here?
Pressure. Okay.
Pressure.
Okay. I'm going to say two different camps.
Start the timer. No, I'm just kidding.
Time is on. Okay. For long term, these are the kinds of ones you're looking at with a tech focus, and you've got to remove, the speculative aspects entirely. These ones are the ones that I think, you're looking at more as something that it is a utility bet. Is something, or perhaps, even as a currency. So, let's start with Bitcoin for the reasons we went into before. That's got to be in there. Ethereum, simply because of its position, safe bet. So I'm playing it safe to start off with. And then
let's give us a thrill, Brad. Give us a thrill.
All right, I'm going to say something that you might not know of that haven't even come out yet, that I'm looking into now. I'll think things like NEAR. I'm very bullish on what NEAR is bringing to sharding with the team.
NIA?
NEAR. So NEAR.
NEAR, okay.
The protocol, the team, the token, it's one to absolutely look at. Scale, I'm very, very interested in that team and code, SKALE. With
NEAR.
Scale. Yep, once again, they are, as we talked about, one to watch with regard to the potentials to really, add to the potentials of scaling solutions. The tech is just, it's second to none in my opinion. Then, obviously, are we for its use case looking at finance? I strongly encourage people to look at DAI, look at Compound as a company that is directly correlated to that.
When you say DAI, are you talking about DAI or Maker?
Maker DAI. So looking at exactly what Maker does in the context of DAI, understanding what an investment is as opposed to DAI, which is in my opinion really a fundamental means of money that supports Maker. If we look at verticals like gaming, I would say once again it's really going to come down to what has prominent attention, because when it comes to price, that's a very different thing to building those what would you call it, the requisites for a community. That's going to take some time. So in this light, I would say Engine has already done a lot, and most importantly, it was backed by gaming, sort of a pre-blockchain gaming company, and they have a very interesting token model. That's one of the reasons why I want to know more about how they go in the future.
We've actually reached out to Engine for various points in our development, and everything. They're run like a very well-oiled machine, extremely responsive.
I'm impressed.
Extremely quick. Within minutes of reaching out to them, they had escalated us to one of their top developers, who sent us a build that wasn't even out yet, and just with, we didn't even have a relationship with them. They were just on it, and they're there to serve the developers in a really. So I've only positive things to say about Engine.
Right.
Say that I know that their token's going to go up. I think that's but I think that they're a well maintained team and very professional for game devs.
That's good to know. In Asia, one of the projects that's always impressed me, and it won't impress people in terms of price at the moment, but again, this is not about a short-term play. I'm interested in Trius, because they have serious connections when it comes to real enterprise, real utility, and they're really working a lot on that. In Singapore, they interest me a lot because of the progressive nature of and stance the government's taken. So I'm really going to look more into some of the stuff emerging there. At the moment, obviously, people would know I'm an ambassador for Morpheus Labs, but again, the reason why I choose to be an ambassador for anything is so I'm not representing every single startup and doing simply paid reviews. So that's one where I invested in them also, but I also wanted to look more at those enterprise sort of conduits, how we can better improve blockchain in that domain, and as you said, bringing forth the potentials of blockchain to that arena, to that very untapped, largely SME sector, for example. And then one area I think people don't talk about enough in the future, and we're yet to see this play out, is what's going to happen when it comes to equity. What will happen with regard to blockchain and making bets that may not be utility based? We don't know if it's going to be plausible to actually make a considered bet and focus on the genuine growth of that asset in a legitimate and sort of dividend offering way. I think that's a conversation that people don't yet know how that's going to play out, but every indicator suggests it's still plausible. But then, going back to speculation, I think we should end on that, because one thing I will say is that if you're going after the money, if you're not there for the long term, and some of those ones that I mentioned are just examples, there's so many, the quiet operators that aren't there in the forefront with endless news. But if you really want to know, those that are going to pop, as they say, they are the ones that also, most importantly, understand the crypto game. And that's something you need to pay attention to, because if you start to see a strong community that's doing, consistent, authentic announcements and partnerships, in the short term, there's going to be moves had on those. So it doesn't really matter which of those I mentioned. Just know that that's part of the short-term play of many of these, as we talk about in those movements of waves through crypto. So in more recent past, we've seen the likes of things like DAG, DAG with their movements, and they're doing a lot there, arguably forging partnerships. We've seen the likes of ChainLink, and then in the future, perhaps there's those that are supported directly with Binance, for example, the likes of Carver, the likes of Bend, as I mentioned. We don't know what's going to play out there, but one thing I do look at is what is the liquidity of these assets, when they start to pop, because often there are requisites in there as well, Elliot, that make it attractive for, more holistic support, whether that be from liquidity providers, whether that be from, the marketing team. But underneath everything, there has to be legitimacy, there has to be real announcements, and they have to be sustained. But there is that important component. So certainly people are seeing things pop, in a bear market now, and they do that, in a very sort of, how can I explain? They don't do it in a necessarily sustained way. And that's why people need to really look at that if they're interested in the trade game. But long term, going back to the beginning.
Well, it kind of goes to the question of, can you ever, and like, it's probably why you haven't stocked up on ChainLink. Is there ever a moment where you get as much excitement as a Coinbase listing and a Google partnership? Like, what combination of events could ever lift the community to be more enthusiastic than those things? We'll see. There might be events in the future, but for the most part, that might have been a big over speculative moment for them. And yeah, I mean, you've laid out some amazing projects here, certainly ones that I'm not familiar with, and I spent all day in this stuff. So I know that it's pretty amazing here. And I just want to thank you for dedicating your wisdom and sharing it with the audience. You guys have your homework cut out for you, as Brad has laid out an absolute breadth of projects here, a smorgasbord.
Well, I promise you next time I'll be more prepared and I'll have a list, because I wasn't quite prepared for that, and I should have been, and I do apologize. But as I said, at the end of the day, I think you said something that is so important to finish off on, and that is that, yes, there are these catalysts, these short-term catalysts that really garner or capture the imagination and attention of the wider audience, Elliot, and they certainly do, relate in price, because obviously the speculation is still so prominent. But, in time, this is what I'm hoping for, and I think you are too, is that there will be a significant shift in terms of what upholds value. And if users determine value based on real use case, real tech, and real applications, then we're going to see the best part about crypto come to life, and that is sustained value over the long term, not, just these, where the needles, the pendulum swings, or the needle, rises and falls so rapidly. That's what I'm looking forward to, because as much as we love to sort of play in the volatility space, we also definitely, as proponents of tech, want to see the emergence of proof that we aren't just here, for the short term. We are here to stay. We're here to play. And we're here to change the whole paradigm itself.
Yeah, we want to see the graph build up and to the right. We don't want to see a spike and a drop and a drop. We want to see consistent growth.
People.
Yeah, that corresponds with the actual meaning it has in people's lives, you know, and as it means things to people and it provides that value, we want to see the growth of that value be corresponding to the actual real world meaning. And I think that's a great place to leave off. So thank you so much, Brad. It's been certainly an amazing amount of information that you've shared, and we hope to have you back on the show very, very soon.
Mate, thank you so much. And, you know, make sure you come on my channel as well. I'm really keen to learn more about Tron and more about coding and more about gaming.
Would love to do it. So thank you so much, Brad. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that video. I know I certainly did. If you enjoyed it, please throw a like on this video and don't forget to leave a comment in the comment section below. As usual, I'm Elio Trades, you're watching FUD TV, and I will see you very soon on the next episode.